All right, everybody, this is going to be a great episode because we're going to be talking about reproducing mini chameleons. And if you thought mini chameleons were adorable, imagine a hatchling mini chameleon. Yeah. And so Dr. Nash is going to be talking today about how to reproduce the smallest of the chameleons. Let's turn it over to him and find out.
Okay, so for the last part of this discussion, I'll talk a bit about reproducing mini chameleons, tiny chameleons, as well as how to deal with the babies and how to raise them. So as far as reproducing these small chameleons, I'll start with tiny Calummas first. I should mention, many of these are being imported, and most of the ones you see available are wild caught at the time of this recording. Now, myself and I think maybe a couple of other people have been able to reproduce a number of these tiny Calumma species in captivity, however, and I put out a number of guides in particular that focus on how to breed certain species. So, and those include Calumma roloco, Calumma lenotum, and I'm working on another one right now. So these are online, but I'll just give a brief kind of overview on how to approach the reproduction of these really fascinating species. So for the tiny Calummas, they will dig in order to lay their eggs. I say this up front because oftentimes the wild-caught individuals that come in, the females, tend to be gravid. And for them, their clutch sizes are very small, way smaller than most other chameleons. So we're talking a clutch size of between 2 to 5 eggs. Very frequently it's 2. In some species, I've never seen it more than 2. Some, Calumma lenotum in particular, I've seen up to 5. So that's the range of egg numbers we're talking about. They will dig to bury them, but they'll dig very, very shallow. So this is an inch or less. Oftentimes they'll dig just right under maybe a leaf on the surface of the soil and just go right underneath it, or they will tend to dig under some kind of structure. So if there's some kind of leaf or there's some kind of branch or foliage or something immediately above the soil, oftentimes they'll dig underneath that, and that's where they will lay their egg or eggs. Alternatively, they might lay in the corners of the enclosure. So this is important because I find the most effective way to keep these chameleons is with a bioactive setup. If that's the case, then there is dirt available. And I have never had to put a tiny Calumma in a lay bin. They will lay in their enclosures. However, as I said, they have certain spots that they prefer. So if you know that and you're aware of the type of things they prefer to lay under, so some kind of cover, a warmer region perhaps, or the soil temperature is maybe 72 degrees, around that, you can very easily find the eggs by simply sweeping your fingers over the soil and unearthing the top ½ inch to maximum 1 inch, and that will help you find the eggs. However, these chameleons, since they only have a couple of eggs at a time, it can be a bit harder for people to tell that they're carrying eggs at all. So this is a skill that I don't recommend everyone try, but if you're very, very careful, it is possible to slowly, gently palpate, meaning sort of feel, the sides of the chameleon. And if there are eggs developing and they're far enough along, they'll be very, very apparent. And you'll be able to feel hard kind of circles or spheres in these chameleons. Now, do not do that if you're not comfortable. If you're wondering whether they're gravid or not, you can introduce them to a male, see what the response might be, and oftentimes when they inflate or flatten or respond, then if they are carrying eggs, at that time you can see them visible from the sides. So those are a couple of ways you can use to identify whether they're gravid or not, and that's a brief overview of how they lay. In your particular setup, they might pick a certain spot that they deem as appropriate for egg laying, and if you keep the same animal in the same enclosure, it's very common for them to pick the same exact spot for all of the subsequent clutches. This makes things much easier because you can just sort of keep an eye on them, see how the eggs are developing, and check the same spot regularly to sort of harvest eggs from the enclosure rather than having to separate them, separate the chameleon, put it out in a lay bin or something like that. So that's just a general overview. Now, as far as getting them to breed, that's of course another topic. These are very seasonal creatures. All of the tiny Calummas I'm aware of, they live in environments where there is some substantial seasonal variability. Based on the size and quantity of individuals that are imported or exported, depending on the time of year, it does appear that certain species have a seasonal breeding pattern, whereas some others don't have as strong of a seasonal breeding pattern. So just as an example, Calumma lenotum seems to have a pretty clear time of year when you see babies emerge and when adults tend to be receptive to one another. This is sort of at the peak rainy season. You can find them imported at other times of the year, but you can tell they are all adults and you don't see any new babies or smaller individuals at certain times. So based on that, it appears that there is some seasonal reproduction. Now, for something like Calumma loco, that's a little bit less obvious. And when they come in, depending on time of year, there's not a whole lot of obvious signs that they're seasonal breeders. Now, with that said, in the wild, they still might rely on certain cues to trigger breeding. So, across the board, I do recommend using some kind of seasonal variation in amount of water available, as well as temperatures. So, they should never not have water available, of course. They should always be healthy and safe, but the frequency of water being offered and the temperatures can vary depending on what you're trying to replicate. I could go into this for many of these small species, but what might be best is to look up the climatic conditions you're interested in for the species you're working with and try to replicate that, generally speaking. But many of these changes largely include a bigger difference between daytime temperature and nighttime temperature during the dry season, a less of a difference between day and night temperature in the rainy season, and of course, higher misting or water availability frequency in the wet season compared to the dry. So, generally speaking, in my experience, these chameleons breed during the wet season, and in captivity, they breed during the replicated or simulated wet season. So, in order to stimulate breeding, I'd recommend initiating the wet season, maybe giving it a week or two, and then start by introducing them to one another. Keep in mind that if you're working with wild-caught animals, it's very possible that the female is already gravid. Now, if this is the case, they can store sperm and have up to 4 clutches, in my experience, from a previous mating. And the clutches are often fertile. So if the female is non-receptive and it's a wild-caught animal, it's pretty likely that she is gravid and carrying eggs. If that's the case, it's best to treat her as if she is gravid and simulate a wet season and feed her with increased vitamin A supplementation, assuming she's carrying eggs and will deposit them. That's generally safer. When we're working with Madagascar imports, our seasons are more or less flipped. So the question becomes, do you want to change the schedule of these animals that arrive via import to match the US or Europe, wherever you are, climate pattern? Or do you want to continue replicating the Madagascar season that they would be experiencing at that time? So that's sort of a judgment call to make, but there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. Oftentimes, if I get imports in at the very beginning of the year, or the import season, I should say, so that's generally speaking, maybe November, then even though it's getting cold here in the US, and thus it would be very easy to replicate a dry season over here, I will often go through the extra effort of replicating a wet season, since that's what these animals were more or less expecting to enter in their native range. But if you really want to sort of convert them to the US or wherever you are scheduled, then you could, of course, start replicating a dry season, and that might be fine as well. So breeding for the tiny Calummas in particular, although this is somewhat applicable to some Brookesia as well, is somewhat interesting because it can occur over multiple days. So there's some circumstances where you introduce the two chameleons together and it's just very, very clear the female is not interested, aggression might ensue, they should be separated. But there's also this state you might observe where the female isn't aggressive but doesn't appear receptive and might be showing maybe half of the non-receptive coloration. In these circumstances, I actually recommend leaving the male and the female together. And the reason is for two reasons. One of which is what's been observed in the wild. The other is what has been observed in captivity. In the wild, a number of chameleon species, and tiny Calummas in particular, have been observed spending a lot of time together around the breeding season, pairs, males and females. Now, whether this represents any true bonding or if it's simply a mate guarding behavior is somewhat unclear. But the point is that they will interact with each other for a long time leading up to actual mating. And that's somewhat interesting and rather unique. I've seen the same thing happen in captivity. Sometimes after 3 days, they will start sleeping closer to one another in the enclosure. They'll start sharing a branch, for instance. They'll sort of move towards one another over the course of a few days, and then eventually they will actually mate. So when breeding these species, it's sometimes best to give them a few extra days, more than you would usually for other species of chameleons. Now, incubation is really variable amongst these species, but based on the climate conditions you're interested in for the species you're working with, it's usually pretty apparent which ones will benefit from a diapause. Calumma lenotum, for instance, comes from high mountain regions, which get very cold, especially at night, especially in the dry season. Thus, they seem to require a diapause during incubation to allow for readily incubating eggs that hatch at a defined and controllable time. Something like Calumma roloco or Calumma boatgrai live in very relatively tropical areas of Madagascar where the seasonal variation is not as severe and the climate is not as variable. For these species, no diapause is necessary. Eggs will hatch in about 3 to 4 months, typically 4. So some work needs to be done to look into what species need which conditions for incubation, but just for knowledge here, or just to give some information, Calumma lenotum requires a diapause for a quick incubation. So with a diapause, they'll hatch as soon as 5 to 6 months, up to 9. Without a diapause, they'll hatch in a year, maybe 13 months. Calumma boatgrai, Calumma roloco, Calumma phalanx all do not require a diapause. So with them, the eggs can be kept in the low 70s, and typically they'll hatch at around 4 months. Now, one note about egg incubation for these tiny Calumma species is, as I said earlier, they dig very shallow holes to lay their eggs in. Thus, the eggs are not as sheltered from the elements compared to some other species that might dig and lay their eggs much deeper. Therefore, it seems likely that these eggs, which again are very shallow, are subject to daily changes in temperature and humidity, just simply due to day versus night. They're only under half an inch of soil, so they may as well be out in the open almost. So with that in mind, if possible, I always try to incubate these eggs with a day-night variation. So oftentimes, this can be done just by keeping them out in the open, maybe in a basement somewhere where there is some natural variation with day and night. There's some incubators that are supposed to be able to do this, but they're somewhat hard to find. If you find one, then that's great. I'd recommend giving a difference between the day and night temperatures of incubation. When I've done that, eggs hatch quickly, offspring are very healthy. I prefer doing it that way in general. Now, once the eggs hatch, babies are very small, and they're small compared to almost every other chameleon species you're likely to work with. In fact, Brookesia, tend to hatch much bigger than most Calumma, or most tiny Calumma species. That's with a couple of exceptions, like Brookesia theli. It's very, very tiny when it hatches. So when they hatch, they're extremely prone to dehydration. They're also prone to starvation if you don't provide food that is easily accessible to them. So that's where the springtails come in. That's where the melanogaster fruit flies come in. That's where the parasitic wasps and aphids come in. So this very early stage of development, it's very important to make sure there's lots of food readily available at all times in the form of these very, very tiny bugs. However, once you get that going, and there's a regular supply of tiny feeders, the enclosure is bioactive, there's springtails available to eat, there's lots of humid areas available, they will sort of self-regulate, and you can more or less just let them do their own thing. They know what they're doing, they just require the right environment. Now, for babies in particular, I'd recommend using even more plants than you would otherwise. And this means plants of various textures, of various leaf size, lots of variation there. I'd say up to 80% of the enclosure should actually be full of plants. An easy way to do this is with some grass, some wire vines, some pea plants, some small plants that you grow from seeds, as well as maybe a couple of more structural plants as well. But a lot of the enclosure should be full of plant matter. And plant matter that has small stems and small leaves, which allow for more usage of the surface area by the chameleons. That's the general strategy. Remember, looking at these things, these tiny, tiny babies of this tiny group of tiny chameleons, we're talking hatchling weights of 0.1 to 0.2 grams. Very, very, very small. Smaller than a medium-sized cricket. So one needs to be very careful. Number one, do not let them get to the screen under the lights because they can desiccate extremely quickly and die as a result. Number two, they should be given, as I said, an enclosure with a lot of plants. They can find the most humid microclimates as needed. Should be given lots of food, as I said. And of course, one needs to be careful to not blow mist in their face by kind of separating the mister nozzle itself from the closest perching spot. And of course, the fogging discussion I mentioned earlier, they should either not be able to get near the actual fog hole where the fog is coming out of, or the fog should be administered very carefully through extremely tiny holes so as not to flood these animals with unnatural amounts of speedy, thick fog. So respiratory distress is another thing we'd like to avoid, and that can be done by paying close attention to airflow. Sometimes I'll add a fan or two on top, blowing towards each other on top, so it sort of pushes air gently down into the enclosure. Of course, if that's drying it out too much, that's also an issue, so a little less airflow might be beneficial if you're struggling with humidity. Get the humidity right, and then you can start changing the fan speeds, the fan durations, in order to help get the exact levels you want. Now, with all this said, assuming there's somewhat of a temperature gradient, it's not too hot, all these conditions are met, it's almost like growing a plant. They just go off on their own, they handle everything that they need to. I would recommend keeping them individually, but since they're so extremely tiny, I have had some success raising them together in a bigger enclosure, hybrid enclosure, where all the conditions are still met. Of course, individual raising is always the best thing to do for a number of reasons. They grow actually pretty quickly. And again, for hatchlings, regardless of what the season is, wherever you are, I recommend replicating a rainy season for them because that is when it appears many of them are hatching, and that gives them the best chances to grow quickly and be healthy. So that's what I'd recommend for that. Now, as far as when the best time is to sell one, this is a bit different than the way we think about it for many other chameleon species. For many other chameleons, we say 3 months, maybe 4 months for them to get to an appropriate size. But in reality, many of these chameleons, when fully grown, are not even the size of a 2-month panther chameleon. In some cases, they're about the size of a 1-month panther chameleon, 1 month old. So unless we're willing to raise them all the way to adulthood, in this case, I think it makes sense to send them out a bit earlier because they're never going to reach a size that is comparable to a panther chameleon, for instance. So typically I'll wait a couple of months until they're at least eating high-DI fruit flies and crickets regularly. I think that makes the most sense as a benchmark of when they can be sold, because at least that way the new keeper doesn't necessarily have to go out of their way to find these unique tiny feeders like the parasitic wasps or aphids, for instance. So I think that's a general good benchmark when they're readily eating the more commonly available feeders. Typically, this is when they're maybe a third to a half fully grown. So one other thing I should mention for this discussion about reproduction of these animals, I mentioned that many of them are wild caught. And that is true. There are some captive breeding successes. But again, I've published a number of articles on that available for people to read if there's more interest and people want to look very closely at exact parameters to use. But it's important to note that these exports and therefore imports could stop at any moment. All the species I'm referring to today are from Madagascar. Unfortunately, a number of them are brought in, perhaps accidentally, perhaps on purpose, under the wrong species name. So really, the two main tiny Calummas that we have quotas for are Calumma nasutum and Calumma brookesia. Unfortunately, these are all very hard to tell apart for most people. So under Calumma brookesia or Calumma nasutum, we see things like Calumma loco come in, Calumma linotum, Calumma phalanx, and perhaps a couple of others. On occasion, we will actually see real, true Calumma brookesia and Calumma nasutum come in, but most of the time they're misidentified. This matters because many of the chameleons misidentified, Calumma linotum, Calumma loco, Calumma phalanx, and so on, have zero allowable export quota. There's various reasons for why this might be. There's a whole committee of people and various organizations working to establish what the appropriate quota might be. But for some of these chameleons, they've only been recently discovered, and the reason they don't have a quota is because we don't know enough about their wild populations to even know how many can be sustainably harvested. So with that said, these animals should not be bought as wild caughts if the purpose is simply to keep them as a pet. The goal is to produce enough captive bred individuals where they can be kept as pets, and that has happened so far. So a number of captive bred individuals have been sent out, and there's actually a lot of interest in the community of keeping them. But if you're interested in keeping these species right now, it's going to be by far better to wait for a captive bred individual to be available than getting a wild caught one. As I said, the exports might stop at any moment, and many of these species are either endangered or simply we don't know enough about them to tell whether it's okay or not to be taking those wild populations. So really, any of them that enter the country should be being reproduced. The export might stop at any moment. So that's the best use of these animals right now. It's best for the species, in my opinion. As I said, it's very hard to tell what distinguishes each of these species. Perhaps we'll make a guide available to make this more clear, but there's various Facebook groups. If you're interested in working with one, I'd recommend posting there, asking for identification help, or the chameleon forums. There you can post and ask questions about what species is this to be totally sure. Many of these species will not interbreed, nor should they. So it's very important to be able to identify what species you're working with. Generally speaking, the most common imports you see under the name of Calumma brookesia are Calumma linotum. Calumma brookesia also comes in occasionally, but usually it's Calumma linotum. Under Calumma nasutum, you'll typically see Calumma phalanx come in, which is very hard to distinguish from true Calumma nasutum, as well as Calumma roloco. Calumma roloco are easy to tell apart because the males are green on top with a white abdomen, or rather belly. Reptiles don't technically have abdomens. So those are pretty striking. You can tell when you have a male Calumma roloco. The rest might need a bit of help. It might be a bit beyond the scope of this to go through exactly how to identify each of them, but don't assume that just because they were imported under a certain name that they actually are that species. So as far as moving forward with this group of incredible chameleons in the captive breeding community, I think there's actually a lot of hope and there's a lot of excitement. And these fill a pretty interesting niche. A friend I've worked with, Miguel Mendez, has actually compared them to dart frogs. And I think that's an apt description. They're very small. They sort of go about their business without much maintenance once things are set up. They just eat bugs from the bioactive setup. They go where they need to in the enclosure full of live plants. And they're very small. They eat similar things, and they really make a beautiful addition to most collections. These are so small, though, that handling them is, I wouldn't personally recommend it. They tend to be relatively calm, relatively easy to handle and move and work with, but holding something so extremely tiny is just somewhat risky. It's easier to hurt them. They're more of a display animal overall, I'd say. But they're beautiful. They tend to be, they acclimate actually quite nicely to captivity, assuming the appropriate amount of humidity and nutrition and water is available. They are very fun to feed. And furthermore, they can continue laying clutch after clutch after clutch, provided they're in a bioactive setup. So many of the egg binding problems you see with captive chameleons don't tend to be an issue for these tiny calummas because they will lay in their enclosure in very shallow soil very readily. So they'll just kind of keep reproducing. Again, they may have up to 4 clutches from one mating. So even if you forget that they're developing eggs or you have to go out of town or something, it's usually not a big deal. They can lay their eggs in the enclosure without issue. You can remove them later if you like. That's one thing I should have mentioned. Although they do bury their eggs, again, it's very shallow. So if some spray happens to hit the soil and unearth some of the eggs, they're very, very tiny. And as such, it's possible that feeder bugs could bite a hole in them. I'd be very careful of slugs and snails, which notoriously will do this. So be sure the environment does not have those. And furthermore, isopods will do the same thing. Isopods are not something I necessarily recommend for a bioactive setup for these tiny chameleons, and part of the reason for that is many of the species of isopods are large, in some cases almost half the weight or half the size of these very tiny chameleons. They've also, in some circumstances, actually taken a couple of bites out of smaller chameleons. And of course, there's the egg issue. Furthermore, these are small enough for the amount of waste material produced by them, in my opinion, is not enough where isopods are really needed. It tends to just break down with some springtail assistance. With that said, I think that generally covers most aspects of reproduction. I talked a bit about the future of this community and these beautiful tiny calummas, tiny chameleons in captivity, and I do think that the future looks good. They simply occupy a slightly different niche than we're used to chameleons occupying. However, we've demonstrated that we can keep very tiny animals alive, things like dart frogs and small geckos, things like that, without issue. So if we can start viewing these chameleons at filling those similar tiny animal niches, I think there's a very bright future for them. And myself and I think a few others are doing what we can to help provide captive bred individuals for the future. They really make nice pets. They live for actually longer than you'd expect, at least a few years in most cases, except for wild caughts, which might live a couple years, but are generally more fragile. And overall, they're really a joy to keep. So keeping them is really pushing the hobby forward, I think, and it is opening the door for more niches in what we keep to be open to different chameleons, which I think is very exciting.
So thank you very much, Dr. Nash. And this is a serious topic because these mini chameleons aren't very widespread, in captivity, I mean. And so if the imports stop, they could be lost to us. Therefore, it is important that those of you who are interested in breeding the mini Calummas, mini furcifers, or the Brookesia, that you try it out and become part of the captive breeding program. You know me, if it's a chameleon, I'd love to see it established. But it's a lot of work, and it takes a community. The good news is that with the Chameleon Academy, we do have a community that supports each other. And so, if you're interested in any one of the mini chameleons, talk to Dr. Nash, talk to me, and we can talk about establishing those captive breeding programs. With that, I want to say thank you very much for joining me and Dr. Nash here. And I encourage you to keep wondering and keep researching about the mini chameleons. I'll see you next time.